I'm Michael Dukes, Director, Center for Land Use Efficiency with UF-IFAS, and I am glad to welcome you to the 8th of our 11 Landscape Summit talks each Wednesday at 1 p.m. Today we have two speakers with a water quality stormwater pond theme. First up is Dr. Mary Lusk. She's an assistant professor of urban soil and water quality at the Gulf Coast Research and Education Center. She conducts research on how landscape management practices at site and neighborhood scales influence storage and fate of constituents that may lead to water quality degradation. She has a PhD in soil and water science from University of Florida. After Mary, Dr. A.J. Reisinger. I always get hung up on your name, A.J.
That's good.
He's an assistant professor of urban soil and water quality. That's awesome. He's in Gainesville in the Soil and Water Science Department. He conducts research on nutrient and energy cycling in aquatic ecosystems and terrestrial environments, and his extension program focuses on improving water quality in urban environments. And AJ has a PhD from the University of Notre Dame in biology. With that, Mary, we'll have you go ahead and the floor is yours. All questions in the chat, please.
All right, thanks, Michael. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Really excited to speak to all you guys at the Urban Landscape Summit. It's always one of my favorite events of the year, and it's kind of weird to be doing it virtually this year, but I like this format. Every Wednesday we get to see new stuff. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit today about what goes into your stormwater pond and what happens to it and what comes out of your stormwater pond. Just as a prelude to my presentation today, I want you to see this aerial photographs. This is from Hillsborough County in 1948 versus 2016. So the same spot, exact same spot on both sides of the picture here, but a big difference, right? Because of urban development. And one thing that's in common on both of these sides of the picture, though, is water features. You can see on the left side some depressions in the landscape that have collected water. And you see those same areas that have collected water on the right side, but they're different a little bit, right? And that pre-development side on the left side, those would be pre-development wetlands and depressions in the landscape. And when we develop that land, we got to do something still to collect the water that drains and runs over that land. What are those things in the developed landscape? Well, in most cases, particularly here in Florida, that turns out to be our stormwater ponds. So the original stormwater treatment, like we had there on the left side of that picture, was our wetlands and our natural depressions, where excess water running over the landscape would collect and pool and go through processes of the hydrologic cycle. Today's stormwater treatment in our urban areas, many parts of the state, especially right around here in the Gulf Coast area where I'm located, it looks more like these man-made ponds that are pocketed in our neighborhoods. And those pre-development versus post-development water features in our landscape, we really hope that they're doing the same thing. Pre-development, those wetlands and natural depressions that we had, we hope, we know that they were controlling flooding and providing habitat for wildlife. They were involved in cycling of nutrients and other contaminants that would provide us some water quality benefit. And then just have an aesthetic appeal. They're beautiful, right, to look at because of the wildlife and the water feature that they provide. In our neighborhood stormwater ponds, we hope that they are doing all of those same functions for us. And I hope that in the talk that I give today, and I think particularly in AJ's talk later on, we're going to touch on that a little bit, what is really happening in these urban landscapes, particularly in these urban ponds, and especially in terms of water quality. That's the big focus of what we'll be looking at today, is taking a look to see if these ponds are providing water quality benefits for us, what are they doing, and maybe how can we think differently about them to make sure that they provide some benefit for us, like the wetlands do in our pre-developed landscapes. So with that in mind, here's a brief overview of where I'd like to go today. First, start with just an overview of why we have stormwater ponds, then talk a little bit about what goes into stormwater ponds. So the water goes in, obviously, but what is that water carrying? and then what comes out of the stormwater ponds. That's really important because often stormwater ponds here in Florida are hydrologically connected to other bodies of water, like a creek or a stream that then may flow on to Tampa Bay estuary or the Atlantic Ocean or some other body of water. I'm going to share some recent research on stormwater and stormwater ponds that I've been a part of here in my lab in Hillsborough County, and talk very briefly about some of my extension and community education efforts about stormwater and stormwater best management practices. All right, you probably have seen an image like this before. It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? We're looking here at natural ground cover versus impervious surfaces in developed and undeveloped or pre-developed landscapes. And that natural ground cover, what happens when rain comes down? Rainwater comes down, about 50% of that soaks into the ground because it's vegetative soil and is able to infiltrate that rainwater. And we only have about 10% that runs off. But after we develop these urban landscapes, like the ones I showed you in those first pictures, things kind of get switched and they trade places a little bit. Now we've got like 55% of that water that can't soak into the ground, and so it just runs off and becomes stormwater runoff because of that proliferation of those hard impervious surfaces that can't infiltrate that rainwater. And if not managed correctly, it can lead to situations like this, flooding. Flooding in our urban areas, which obviously we need to be concerned about and work to control. So simply put, stormwater ponds are constructed to collect and store excess runoff in our urban landscapes so that we can have somewhere for all that extra water to go, and we can store it for some period of time, and then allow it to either be released slowly or infiltrate into the groundwater slowly instead of flooding. How stormwater ponds work, you have probably seen features of them if you've been around them very much and walked around and looked at them. Again, runoff flows in, and the water level within that pond is then controlled by some type of outlet structure that can release water gradually or slowly with time, so that the flow of that water is slowed down during a storm. So that outlet structure slows the release of the water, again, mitigating downstream flooding. As water is flowing into these ponds, most of the time, any solid pollutants like soil sediments, maybe grass clippings or leaves, any type of solid can usually settle out to the bottom of that pond, but dissolved pollutants, things that have dissolved in the water, like some heavy metals or particularly nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, those may not settle out, so they just may flow right out as the water flows out of that pond. And because of this settling versus some things flowing outward, we get variable removement of pollutants from our ponds. All right, so I want you to consider an urban neighborhood that looks a lot like the one with the house here on the right. I'm sure you've all seen urban neighborhoods in Tampa, a lot like this. On the left side of the screen is a schematic of a neighborhood. All the little green rectangles are lots, so home lots within a neighborhood. The little blue thing there in the middle is a stormwater pond in a neighborhood. And what do you think the little blue circles are on that left map, and the blue lines? Those are the stormwater network, and the stormwater pipes and the stormwater inlets on the street. So this is a curb and gutter neighborhood where stormwater flows through gutters in the neighborhood, and then all comes together and joins a pipe here at this end of the neighborhood and flows into that stormwater pond that's right there. In this case, this was a picture of or it's a map of a neighborhood that's in Hillsborough County. In this case, after stormwater enters that pond that's there in the center of the left-hand picture, it flows onward to Little Fish Hawk Creek, which is a tributary of the Alachua River, which is a part of the Tampa Bay watershed. So anything going from those houses can flow into the stormwater network, can flow to that pond, can then flow onward, and eventually make its way to the Tampa Bay estuary. But think about a neighborhood like this and take a look at that picture, and in your mind, think about what might be some sources of pollutants, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus nutrients, that might be moving from that landscape into the stormwater flow and into that stormwater pond. So I went around my neighborhood in Pasco County, Florida, a couple years ago and took some pictures really quick of some of those things in the neighborhood that can be contributing nutrient pollution to a stormwater pond. And these are pictures that I took within like just 10 minutes of walking around my neighborhood. First one here, hopefully you see what's wrong with this picture, but I see this so much everywhere I go. This is where runoff from the roof is being directed from the downspout right to the driveway. That driveway is an impervious surface, right? So when runoff from the roof goes to the driveway, then it's just going to flow right back into the street and into that stormwater network, probably right to the pond. And that runoff from the roof can have numerous pollutants in it. It can have bacterial pollution from maybe bird poo on the roof. It can have organic matter from leaf litter on the roof. If you're underneath a tree, it can have a lot of nutrients in it just from rainwater. Rainwater can have nitrogen and phosphorus in it. So right here, a source of pollution to the stormwater. Here's another one, someone irrigating their lawn in my neighborhood, and you can see from the front of the picture how the wetting front of that sprinkler system is hitting the sidewalk. Well, how could that be a source of nutrient pollution to stormwater? If that irrigation water is reclaimed water or formerly treated wastewater, it's going to have some level of nitrogen and phosphorus in it. And if that sprinkler system is hitting the sidewalk and the streets instead of the lawn, then those nutrients in that reclaimed water can become part of the stormwater flow. And I have seen this. I've gone out, sometimes at night I go out and take pictures where it's just flowing down the street, that reclaimed water, irrigation water that's not being applied wisely. Another example, a bare dirt lawn, a lot of healthy stand of turf grass on this lawn. And so that soil is exposed to erosion every time it rains. Some of that soil gets washed into that stormwater gutter system that you see on the right there. That's just soil that's come from that lawn. And then every time it rains, some of that soil can get picked up and carried into the stormwater network and into the stormwater pond. Not only does that soil carry probably bacterial contamination with it, it's going to have a pretty significant nitrogen and phosphorus load with it as well. Pet waste, of course, can be a significant source of pollutants to our stormwater ponds, particularly bacterial contamination, but also nitrogen and phosphorus. So be sure to clean up after those pets. And finally, just organic matter in the streets. You see this a lot certain times of the year: grass clippings, leaf litter, pollen that accumulates in the street. And every time it rains, that as well can be washed to the stormwater pond. And it's a really significant source of carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus. So all of those things are going into our ponds. Oh, and I forgot one more. The cars, so car emissions and just wear from the tires of your car, those can be sources of heavy metal contamination to stormwater and to stormwater ponds. Tires, especially as they wear with time, will produce little dust particles in the street that can have metals like zinc and cadmium, things like that. All right, so all of those things going into our stormwater ponds creates, this list, this laundry list of potential pollutants that can be going into those ponds, and all those things that I've talked about here. The problem, especially with nutrients, all of those contaminants are problematic, but especially with nutrients, we focus a lot on this in Florida because of our larger water quality issues that we face here. Those nutrients are what feed the algae and aquatic weeds in stormwater ponds that can contribute to just really unsightly water, water that smells bad, water that sometimes can be toxic because of the toxic harmful algal blooms. So that's why we're really concerned about what's going into these ponds and what's happening inside of them. So how are stormwater ponds removing those pollutants? And you'll notice I put the word in the title here, potentially remove, because they don't always remove everything, but they can sometimes remove some of those. Some of the processes that are involved in removal of those pollutants is just natural biological processes. For example, some bacterial pathogens may just die off in the pond. There can also be assimilation or the take-up of nutrients by plants. So if there's a lot of excess nitrogen and phosphorus in that pond, we've got a good stand of aquatic vegetation around the edges of that pond or within that pond. Some of those nutrients can be taken up by plants. Notice that that's a temporary removal only, because what's going to happen when the plants die and they drop their leaves, then those nutrients are pretty much just being returned to the pond. Another process that can remove some of those, can remove nitrogen, is denitrification, which is the conversion of nitrate to a gas that escapes to the air. And this is really one of our only, permanent form of nitrogen removal from stormwater ponds, but it requires special environmental conditions. We have to have the right level of oxygen, and we have to have an organic matter source or carbon source in order for that process to move forward. So we only have denitrification under certain circumstances, but it's really important that we can aim to get that process because, again, it's one of our most important ways of permanently removing nitrogen from our stormwater ponds. And I know AJ's group in his lab, I think they're starting to do some more work on looking at these processes. So hopefully he'll tell you a little bit about that. If not, talk to him later. Again, here's just a schematic, a cartoon of things going into the pond, and this process of maybe things settling out in the bottom. But there's always still going to be some volume of water and pollutant load that's going to float out from that pond. The best data that we have to date in the state of Florida shows that these ponds only remove about 30% of the incoming nitrogen that goes into them, and about 70% of the incoming phosphorus that goes into them. And I want you to pay attention to this part of the diagram that I just circled in red. We're concerned about that for one big reason, is that you see that little part of this diagram that says to stream. Again, these ponds are often hydrologically connected to other larger water bodies. So water that flows out of here is going on to a stream, maybe the Alachua River or the Hillsborough River. Again, subbasins of the Tampa Bay estuary where we have nitrogen problems. And so if these ponds are not removing those excess nutrients, then we're contributing to downstream loading of those nutrients. Here's an amazing diagram that I love. I know it's complicated and crazy, but this just shows you one of the reasons why it's so complicated and it's so hard to get nitrogen removal from those ponds. So consider, for example, a lot of stormwater coming in up there in that upper left-hand corner. Stuff is coming in. It's got fertilizers in it. It's got organic matter. It's got pet waste. It's got atmospheric deposition. All these pollutant sources coming in. And then this weird, crazy nitrogen cycle takes place in there. And what I want you to focus on is kind of in the center of that diagram, there's a little circle that says organic nitrogen right here. So that organic nitrogen, maybe that's organic nitrogen in grass clippings. Let's say somebody blew their grass clippings into the stormwater culvert, and those grass clippings got into the stormwater pond. The nitrogen in that is going to be organic nitrogen. When it gets into the pond, it can likely settle to the bottom of the pond. So if it settles to the bottom and those grass clippings don't flow out, that nitrogen has been removed, right? Yay, it's wonderful. Well, in reality, it's maybe not so wonderful because of these processes that can go on in the pond. So take a look at this organic nitrogen. See the little arrow here, number 2, that goes from organic nitrogen to NH4. Once it's in that pond, nitrogen in those grass clippings can be converted to ammonia nitrogen. And look at this process right here with line number 5, that ammonia nitrogen can be converted to nitrate nitrogen within the pond. That is a dissolved inorganic nitrogen form that is highly available to the phytoplankton that cause algal blooms and is very unlikely to settle out. It's mostly just going to flow onward and be exited here at this other side of the pond on the right side. So a reason why we have very poor nitrogen removal usually in these ponds is because of these processes that are going on inside of that pond. I had some research looking at this a couple of years ago. If you're interested in this paper, I can send it to you. Looked at just nitrogen concentrations in stormwater runoff. So that's on the data that's on the left side, and outflow from a pond on the right side. Let's take a look at total dissolved nitrogen. That's TDN on these little charts. About 1.5 milligrams per liter total dissolved nitrogen in the runoff but 2 milligrams per liter total dissolved nitrogen in that stormwater outflow. So you'll notice that the number on the right is bigger than the number on the left, which says that we had more dissolved nitrogen leaving that pond than we had going into the pond. We call this a net export of dissolved nitrogen. It goes back to exactly that process that I was just telling you about in the previous slide, this idea of maybe the stuff that you see in that left-hand picture, those grass clippings and that leaf litter, that organic nitrogen going into the pond, and then that process of being converted to ammonia and being converted to nitrate, so that ultimately the effect is we've got a lot of dissolved nitrogen that's then able to be in that pond water and to be exported out of it. In that same study, we took a look at the organic nitrogen in that pond and looked at how bioavailable it was, which means how available is it to the organisms that can cause algal blooms. In this case, we inoculated it with bacteria and phytoplankton from the Hillsborough River because that's where this pond was flowing into. In the stormwater runoff, that organic nitrogen, it's the DON in this chart. We're looking at the numbers in bold. In the stormwater runoff, that DON was about 10% bioavailable. But by the time it went out of that pond, it was almost 40% bioavailable. So as that organic nitrogen set in that pond and went through natural pond processes and got worked on and sort of reformulated by bacteria in the pond, it became more bioavailable. And so again, this pond, what we hope is creating a situation where the water that goes out is of a higher quality than what comes in. In this case, that wasn't happening. The water that was going out was something that was more bioavailable to those organisms that can cause the algal blooms. Speaking of phosphorus, I'm switching gears here. Now I'm going to talk about phosphorus in those stormwater ponds. This is a small little study in my lab working on right now, looking at forms of phosphorus in stormwater pond sediments. This work is being done in Pasco County, Florida. We have a series of ponds that we've gone out, collected a bunch of sediments from, and we're analyzing the phosphorus forms in those sediments. And those are the legend that's on the bottom of this graph. So we have KCl-PI, that stands for KCl extractable inorganic phosphorus. Then we have sodium hydroxide, inorganic phosphorus in red, and green is sodium hydroxide organic phosphorus, and the purple is hydrochloric acid, HCl extractable phosphorus. Those are just different forms of phosphorus that can be in sediments. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about the chemistry of what all those mean, but just know that there are different types of phosphorus that we find in sediments. And the blue, the KCl extractable phosphorus, that's phosphorus that is very loosely bound to sediments. And so it can easily move into the water column and become a source of phosphorus within the water of that pond. Don't see a lot of blue on this graph. It's very small. If you look at bar number 12, you see that pond had just a tiny little bit of that loosely bound KCl extractable phosphorus, but most of these ponds have very little of that. The red portion of this graph, again, is sodium hydroxide extractable phosphorus. That is moderately bound, and it can be desorbed or released from pond settlements under most conditions. So we see a lot of that in each of these ponds. So consider that phosphorus that's settled to the bottom. It's in the bottom of that pond, but it's in a chemical form that's going to pretty easily remove itself from those sediments and become part of the pond water above the sediments. Green portion of these bars is organic phosphorus. That's associated with like decaying vegetation in the pond. We need more research on how that's going to behave over time. Don't have a lot of data on whether or not that phosphorus is going to move into the water column or not. And then the purple is HCl extractable phosphorus that we usually consider stable, means it's most likely to stay in the sediments. So a big portion of that in a lot of these ponds was phosphorus that's going to stay in those sediments. And the reason for this is phosphorus combined really well with calcium. And think about our urban environments where we have stormwater stormwater systems conveying stormwater. A lot of times it's a big concrete pipe, right? And that concrete pipe, concrete has calcium in it. So as the stormwater moves through that pipe, it's also picking up some calcium from those pipes. So calcium is getting dumped into these stormwater ponds as well. It's interacting with that phosphorus and binding it in some pretty stable sediments at the bottom. So remember earlier I said that nitrogen removal in ponds was pretty lousy, about 30%. But we could get up to about 70% removal with phosphorus. Phosphorus does a little better. And it's because of this process of being able to create those sort of stable phosphorus sediments in the bottom of those ponds associated, we believe, with calcium. But we do need to continue looking at this and doing some more research on it. All right, so to recap up to this point, stormwater ponds receive various pollutants from the urban environment, perhaps especially nutrients, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Removal of that is at best wishy-washy with about 30% of nitrogen, about 70% of phosphorus. P removal being a little bit better, again, because of P's tendency to bind to some of those sediments in the bottom of the pond. But that's from very sparse research, and we really need more research. But that's what we're working on, and AJ's working on as well, and some others here at the university. All right, I'm going to switch gears now and tell you about some recent research that we're working on in my lab here very quickly. And then I'll wrap it up. So this is a recent study that we're working on looking at stormwater pond effluent and how available it is to Carenia brevis, which is the organism responsible for Florida red tide. So in this study, we took a bunch of pond water samples from Amenity County, incubated it with Carenia brevis, and in collaboration with the Red Tide Institute at Mote Marine Lab, we did some studies of how available that is. So just some background on these ponds. I had a master's student who was involved in also doing some other work on these ponds. And during the time that our Carenia brevis sample, our samples for the Carenia brevis study were taken, is right around November, December, which on these graphs is where, on the one on the left is where everything kind of goes down all of a sudden, and the one on the right is where everything peaks up all of a sudden. This was a time when these ponds were highly eutrophic, so they had a lot of algae in them, and there was evidence of a lot of dissolved organic matter of recent microbial origin, and that's what those graphs there are just showing us. And I can tell you more about those if you're interested, or my student Audrey Geckner, who's now working for AJ, is in the process of publishing that, and there'll be some great data on it. But I'm going to move on. Just keep in mind that the ponds that we sampled for this study had a lot of algae in them, and a lot of indication that they had material in them that we expect would have been very bioavailable to the Carenia brevis. They also had just a ton of the total dissolved nitrogen in them. And we're here on this slide just for context. 1.65 milligrams per liter is considered the threshold, the maximum threshold level for water quality for streams in this part of Florida. So to have 4.5 milligrams per liter total dissolved nitrogen in these ponds, that was a lot of nitrogen in these ponds. Okay, here's the exciting part of the story. After we fed those pond samples to Carenia brevis, these are the growth curves of Carenia brevis in response to these stormwater pond waters. Just different ponds that we're looking at here. Just something to notice here, the experiment went on for 500 hours, but in the early hours of about the first 200 hours of the study, you'll notice here rapid growth of Carenia brevis. I mean, it just went gangbusters when fed this stormwater water. So, in take-home message of the story here is these pond outflows are highly bioavailable to Carenia brevis. It grew very rapidly, it grew very well. Another project that we just published a few weeks ago from another student in my lab, Jinyao Si. This research looked at nitrogen removal from a seasonally dry stormwater pond. So it does not have water year round, but it does during the wet season. She looked at soils in this stormwater basin along a gradient from the inflow. So consider over here on the left side is where stormwater is flowing in, and then that stormwater moves outward into that basin as it rains and the storm is bigger and bigger and bigger. Look at the storms, the soils on the right that correspond to each of those zones in her study. First one, lots of deep organic matter. Next one, a little bit of organic matter, and then less and less of that dark organic matter as you move on. She hypothesized that that would result in variable nitrogen removal along that gradient, because organic matter, again, is very important for that process of denitrification or removal of nitrate from the system. And in fact, it did have exactly that effect. This little image is a cartoon that she put in her paper, just illustrating her points. Nitrogen-rich stormwater coming in, it moves outward and fills that basin. Organic-rich sediments near the inflow promoted high denitrification, but as we moved farther away from that inflow and farther away from those organic-rich sediments, we got less and less nitrate removal. So really has implications here for nitrogen removal during large storms that fill that whole basin. So if we fill that whole basin and the water infiltrates the soil way out there away from the inflow pipe, we're not going to get a lot of nitrogen removal because we just don't have the carbon and the organic matter to support that. Very quickly, also have an extension program related to stormwater ponds. This is in collaboration with some other UF folks. Many have been involved, including AJ, who will speak to you next. It's called the Healthy Pond Certification Program. It is an 8-module online course. If you're interested in this, please shoot us an email. It's everything you ever want to know about stormwater ponds and how to take care of them and how to take care of some common problems like what to do about algal blooms, what to do about nuisance wildlife, all kinds of questions and wonderful things that you would like to know about your ponds. Again, please shoot us an email if you would like to take that course. It's 8 weeks and it's completely online. Culminates with a wonderful field trip where you'll get some hands-on experience. We would love to share it with you. Just to wrap up, I have got to acknowledge the wonderful students that work for me. Some of them are pictured here. I cannot do what I do without them, and I'm so grateful for them and for the work that they do in my lab, and especially grateful for funding that I received from the University of Florida and the Center for Land Use Efficiency and other agencies such as the water management districts in Florida and other groups. So thanks so much to my students. Thanks so much to all of you for listening today, and I will wrap it up. There's my email if you'd like to send me some questions or follow me on Twitter. And I believe I can take some questions for a few minutes, Michael, if that's the plan. If not, I'll turn it over from there.
Yep, that is the plan. So folks that have questions, please put those in the chat. In the meantime, I have some questions, or maybe talking points might be the right word. So it seems like, if I understood your presentation correctly, what we have is stormwater ponds that are primarily, if not singularly, designed for hydraulic treatment, hydraulic capacity of the water, right? And as a side benefit, maybe they have some treatment. Would that be accurate?
Yep, that's the way I would describe it. Yep, absolutely. Yeah. First and foremost, they're designed for flood control, but they might have some pollutant treatment capacity as well.
So, Barbara McAdams says, huge round of applause. Thank you, Mary. So there's almost 100 people applauding right now. Just imagine that. Anyhow, yeah, so it seems like we need another paradigm, and maybe we're going to get into that. Maybe I'm jumping the gun here. We'll get into that. I believe next week we have Evan Bean and Kevin Coyne with DEP. So they'll be talking amendments, really, not necessarily stormwater ponds, but I'm familiar with designed treatment systems, wetland treatment systems that, what we have are stormwater ponds that they handle the flooding. They keep people's houses from roads from being flooded, but they have this other, really probably they weren't even designed to do the treatment that they're achieving. It wasn't a design process based systems, I guess is what I'm getting at. Whereas a treatment wetland is to treat whatever parameter you want to treat. I don't know if you want to comment on that. I mean, is that the direction we need to go? And yeah, I mean, you can just comment on that. Is that the direction we need to go?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely need to take a closer look at these things. And Yeah, that's really the only comment I can say is that we got to take a closer look and we got to get inside that black box of these ponds and really figure out what's going on and realize that perhaps there's better arrangements or better configurations, better designs, both in terms of vegetation, both in terms of size or shape even
Yeah.
of the ponds. Maybe we need to, have the water moving a little bit differently or the depth a little different, or vegetation different. So absolutely.
AJ says he's going to hit on that too. Yeah, and the wicked problem here is we have how many stormwater ponds? You may have mentioned it. How many tens of thousands of stormwater
I
ponds?
did not mention it, but I bet AJ will, and I hope he does. We have almost
Anyway,
76,000 in the state of Florida.
how many?
76,000.
76,000. Okay, so if there is a better way and we find out that we need to retrofit these ponds, it's almost like the septic system problem. Actually, that's a bigger problem, I guess, but it's just a wicked problem because there's a huge number of them. They're in areas that are urbanized. So what's the solution? Maybe, I mean, there will be a solution if we call for one eventually. But anyway, a couple questions coming in here. Any thought that working with statewide master gardener program to offer healthy ponds to them?
Oh. Yeah.
And we may have, no, anyway, that's a thought. I would encourage you to maybe touch base with Wendy Wilbur.
Yeah. So just for the information of the audience, the lead on that program is Abby Turner, who is water extension agent in Sarasota County. She would be the contact person for information on that. But yeah, that's an excellent thought.
Okay, so Jennison Kip says, great presentation. What are the implications of this research with respect to the increasing frequency and intensity of storm events in existing stormwater ponds' ability to provide even marginal nutrient treatment capacity?
Yeah, so big implications. I think there's a lot of things. I indicated in the last little bit of research that I talked about where we had the basin, and as it fills up, there's different nitrogen treatment. Obviously, larger storms are not going to be treated as well as the smaller storms. If we get to the point where we're having larger, more frequent storms, then we're reducing our treatment. For those permanently wet ponds that store water for some period of time and slowly release it, that 30% approximate nitrogen removal that we get and about approximately 7% nitrogen removal that we get, that's based on a certain retention time of water in those ponds. We're assuming that water is staying in the pond for a certain amount of time in order for the processes to go on that will remove it. If we're getting more frequent storms, if we're getting larger storms and we reduce the amount of time that water sits in the pond, huge implications for how much that treatment can proceed. So those about 3% and about 70%, those numbers will probably go down if we have more frequent and larger storms.
Yeah, to just add on to that, typically the way these are designed is based on historical rainfall data. So you have a storm that's a certain magnitude and length. And if that changes, then yeah, your underlying design has changed, or it hasn't changed in response to the change in the weather. Is Healthy Ponds open to the public? Or will it be?
It is a fee-based course, but we would definitely encourage anybody who's interested to take that course. We've opened it in the past to like HOA managers, people on homeowners association boards who are just interested in learning more about the ponds in their community. So yeah, I don't see why not.
Here's an interesting one. When do you expect new designs for new stormwater ponds to be implemented?
I don't know. I know there's talk, but there's always talk. I don't know.
Yeah. So it's not on the near term. I think we can safely say that. Let's see. Healthy Ponds, maybe you could comment because there's quite a bit interested in that. What's the timeline? I know it's going to come out soon, or it just came out. What kind of timeline?
Yeah, we do have a new, oh shoot, I should have this in front of me. We do have a new round of that's going to be later this spring. And I'm sorry, I can't tell you exact dates on that. Shoot me an email, anybody that's interested.
Maybe you could put it in the chat while AJ
Yeah,
gives his
I'll try to
presentation.
dig up some information.
Okay.
In the
Cool.
chat.
AJ's put some, he's backing you up here, put some stuff in the chat. There's a couple links there for folks to take a look at. Let's see. So the questions have tapered off. Let me look at my question list. We got a couple more minutes. I guess, you know, there's a team of you all associated with Center for Land Use Efficiency who have been working on ponds for a number of years. And I wonder, is there, you know, pond plantings and just more than just the pond as a stormwater treatment device. Has anyone measured the biodiversity around ponds or looked into that, both aquatic and terrestrial?
So I think Basil Iannone has looked a little bit at that. I think he's worked mostly on biodiversity related to potential invasive species around the ponds. I'm a bird watcher by hobby, and I would love to get out there and do some sort of like bird biodiversity study on ponds. Every time I walk by a pond, I'm mentally counting the birds, you know. And I noticed that some ponds are bird hotspots and others, there's not a bird to be found. And there's got to be a reason for that.
Yeah.
That's a study on my long list of things I would like to do. Those are the only ones that come to my mind. AJ may be aware of others.
Super interesting. Maybe there's an encore scenario for you, Mary, because I forget his name, but there's an IFAS professor down south somewhere. He might be a pathologist or something, but he's a barn owl expert. Somebody put it in the chat if you know his name. Ray, maybe Ray, Roger Raid, Richard Raid. Richard Raid. Yeah. Fascinating. You can look it up and check him out. So there's hope to be a bird expert then, Mary, in addition to everything else. A couple more questions on healthy ponds. Katie Harper says, I've gone through the certification and highly recommend it. Martha Williams asks, can it be self-paced online and not linked to a calendar?
I will have to get back to you on that.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Right.
I believe it's calendar linked.
So it has structured days and times.
Yeah, but that being said, the modules are all, I mean, we've chopped it up into really short little chunks. We understand everybody's crazy busy and the modules are
We're getting answers. We're getting crowdsourced answers here. It says, Barbara McAdams says, it states that it's self-paced online, but she says check first.
Okay.
There's a field day at the end of the course, so there's some structure there. All right. I think that's all we have time for. We want to get AJ on the floor here. Thank you very much, Mary. Everyone is very appreciative of your, you haven't seen all the comments. I'm seeing them. People are saying very good talk. So, and
awesome.
I concur.
Thank you. I look forward to AJ's talk.
All right. Great pairing. AJ, you are up.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael, for the introduction earlier, and really thanks to Mary for setting me up, and thanks to you all for asking those questions that I think also feed in pretty well to some of the things I'm going to talk about here today. So I'm going to share my screen. First, I'm going to, so that's my presentation, but I wanted to also just highlight this paper that we recently published. It was led by Basil Iannone and his postdoc James Sinclair, and then my wife Lindsay Reisinger did a lot of the sampling for it. But we, in addition to looking at invasive species, invasive plant species in stormwater ponds, we also looked at the macroinvertebrate communities within these ponds. So that's the bugs, the dragonflies, the crayfish, all of that other thing. And so we looked at how different management practices influenced the biodiversity of those macroinvertebrate communities as well. And so that's just another example of biodiversity implications of stormwater ponds that I'll touch on a little bit, but not really in the rest of my talk. So I'm also using, can you see my screen, Michael? Is that good?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm using the auto closed captioning feature on PowerPoint. Hopefully that works for everybody. I'm trying to make all of my work more accessible for people with different needs. So I apologize if that's annoying, but if you stop paying attention, maybe you can read instead of hearing my annoying voice. So the title of my talk today is Can Stormwater Ponds Protect Downstream Water Quality While Remaining an Amenity for the Community? I'm going to jump the gun and tell you that you're probably going to be disappointed by the answer to that question, because I think the answer is maybe. We don't really know yet, which is, I think, is what pretty much any academic ever says when they're asked a question. To give a yes or no answer, the answer is probably we need more research and more money to figure that out. But I'll get into more of the details and what we do know and what we need to learn more about later in my talk. I'd like to start by acknowledging all of the people that have really contributed and pushed this research along. The co-authors of this talk, they're all listed here. Particularly, I'd like to highlight James Sinclair, who was a former postdoc at UF with Basil Iannone. I'd also like to acknowledge all of the UF faculty, extension agents, grad students, and undergraduates that have contributed work that I'm going to talk about here today. I'd like to thank the rest of my collaborators in the Urban Ecosystem Ecology Lab that have really kind of helped me figure out ideas and questions that we want to address in urban environments. And then UF-IFAS and my department for their support, the Center for Land Use Efficiency, and previously the Center for Landscape Conservation and Ecology, who's really funded a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about here today. Lakewood Ranch, where we've done quite a bit of research on stormwater ponds down in Manatee County. And FNGLA, the Florida Nursery Growers and Landscapers Association, provided some funding for some preliminary data that happened right when I first got started here, provided to Basil Iannone. So Mary did a good job talking about urbanization and relative importance, so I'm not going to really spend too much time here. I also think that I've shown this in every single presentation I've ever given at the Landscape Summit, so I don't think I really need to belabor this point. But in case you're not aware, Florida is a rapidly growing state with the projections of more than or almost doubling our population by 2070 relative to 2010. And that doubling of population, you need somewhere to house those people. People need somewhere to live, right? And so in order to house those additional 16 million people that are going to be moving here over the next 60 years, basically the entire peninsula of Florida is going to become developed, or that's the projection. So the red areas here, let me get my laser pointer going. The red areas here are currently developed lands. The dark blue are protected areas, and then the light, or the dark green, and then the light green are everything else. That includes bare land, agricultural land, etc. Basically, if you're not a protected area, by 2070, you're probably going to be developed, become a strip mall or somebody's front or backyard. We can influence how that development happens. We can influence the clustering and the spatial distribution, and also reduce the negative impacts of that development. But people are moving to the state. That's a good thing from a lot of perspectives, from economic perspectives and other things. So my work, and I think a lot of the work done by CLU faculty, is trying to acknowledge the fact that we're an increasingly urban state, but try to figure out ways to balance that with the additional needs of the state and our natural resources. It's important to consider and understand this urbanization process, because urbanization has a lot of impacts on our natural ecosystems. I'm particularly interested in aquatic ecosystems, so freshwater ecosystems, and urbanization has some really well documented and consistent effects on downstream natural water bodies. So as Mary talked about earlier, when an area gets urbanized, you increase the amount of impervious surface cover in that watershed, and that reduces the amount of water that will actually infiltrate into the soil. And instead, that water runs off the landscape really rapidly. And that causes this characteristic shift in the hydrograph. We call this a Flashier Hydrograph. So if we imagine this is stream flow over time after a rain event, this light green line is what it might look like naturally. So you get a little bit of a increase in flow, a bit of a flood maybe, but it's not too drastic, and it's kind of a really delayed process. Versus in an urban watershed, you get all of that water basically flushes across the landscape really rapidly, and you get this huge flood pulse, and it goes away really rapidly as well. And so those flood concerns that has general implications for human well-being, property values, et cetera, but there's also implications for the natural ecosystems themselves. So large amounts of flooding can lead to major issues with urban streams. We expect to see that urban streams often have scoured stream beds with really incised banks. So you can see here, this sewer line kind of got dug into basically because there's so much flooding and erosion happening in this tiny urban stream. You'll often see 10, 20, 30 foot tall banks and really tiny trickles of a stream, because whenever it rains, that water just rapidly runs through the watershed and into that stream network. And then those sediments have to be deposited somewhere, so they get eroded from this headwaters and then they get deposited in some downstream ecosystem, and so that's a major issue as well. We get a loss of hydraulic and connectivity and biodiversity, so we're kind of stopping the natural movement of animals and plants across the landscape and kind of forcing them to go where we're putting the infrastructure for our water. And the activities that we do on the landscape and our routing of this water across our landscape leads to nutrient and pollutant loading that can cause major ecological impacts like harmful algal blooms, fish kills, anoxic events, that sort of thing. So it's important to recognize, though, that these urban ecosystems aren't dead, they aren't worthless. They actually do a lot of work for us on the landscape. So before I came here to UF, I did a review paper where I looked at more than 80 studies of nitrogen dynamics across urban environments in terrestrial areas, aquatic areas, and engineered ecosystems. And what I found is that urban sites all have high rates of nitrogen cycling. So this is a result, these are the results of that review. At the top here is nitrogen mineralization, the middle is nitrification, and the bottom is denitrification. We don't really need to care about what those processes mean right now, but it's just basically rates of transformation of nitrogen in the environment. And each of these boxes represent how well the urban environments did relative to an associated nearby natural ecosystem. So if the boxes are above the 0 line, that means that the urban environment actually had higher rates of nitrogen cycling than the reference ecosystem. So the main takeaway from this figure and this slide right here is that these urban ecosystems are really bioactive. They are good at processing nitrogen and taking up the nitrogen that comes in. So they are as good or better than our natural ecosystems in the environment. Unfortunately, they get a lot more nitrogen coming into them than our natural environment would. So this is another picture, another figure that you don't really need to worry too much about, but the main take home is more precipitation on the x-axis here means that more nitrogen is coming into the system, and the total amount of nitrogen that's retained by these watersheds decreases. So as you get more nitrogen coming into a system or to a watershed, they are less efficient. So they might be still taking up a lot of nitrogen, but not as much relative to what's coming in. So we need to figure out ways to slow down the water and to reduce the amount of nitrogen that's actually coming into our urban water bodies. So there's things like urban stream burial. These urban streams could be daylighted to enhance natural nutrient removal processes. Green roofs or other low impact development strategies scattered throughout the watershed can increase storage of stormwater runoff and increase biological nutrient removal processes. But probably the most common way that we deal with urban stormwater and stormwater runoff is stormwater ponds. In fact, in the United States, stormwater ponds are the most common practice used to deal with the impacts of urbanization on stormwater runoff. So the question was asked earlier, or the conversation of how many stormwater ponds are there in Florida? Well, this paper that James published along with myself and some co-authors last year, we found that there's over 76,000 urban stormwater ponds throughout the state of Florida. So all of these are actually little blue dots, not just giant blue blobs. Each one of these is a tiny blue dot, and each one of those blue dots is a stormwater pond. The total surface area of stormwater ponds in the state of Florida, there's more stormwater pond surface area coverage than in urban industrial land use. There's almost as much stormwater pond land area as there is recreational lands or open spaces throughout the entire state of Florida. So these aren't like little niche, small components of the landscape. They're really prevalent. And you can see that from almost any aerial image you look at of any city throughout the state of Florida. Another way to think about our stormwater system is to look a little bit more closely and look at the connections of our stormwater systems. So this is an overhead Google Maps view of the city of Gainesville. Here we have I-75 running from north to south. Here's kind of the main heart of campus. So this is Gainesville. Anyone that has spent any time at UF is pretty familiar, I'm sure. These red points right here, these are all the stormwater ponds in Alachua County. Some of them are pretty big. Some of them are really small. We did an assessment and found that there's 800 stormwater ponds in the city of Alachua County alone. And so they're really everywhere. But what's even more prevalent are these stormwater systems and the stormwater pipes and ditches that are routing water across our landscape. So we're really good. We as humans are really good at designing drainage networks and plumbing and getting water to go where we want, when we want it to go there. And so we've decided that we want these the stormwater to go to stormwater ponds, and that's primarily for flood control reasons. But this also gives us an opportunity that if we can figure out how to optimize these ponds for water quality benefits, we're already pushing the water to that location. So let's figure out a way to really use these ponds to their maximum benefit. So what do we expect when we're thinking about stormwater ponds? I like to think of this as there's the technical expectation, the reason these ponds are built and designed. And then there's the expectations of the local residents and what people actually think that local pond is supposed to do and what it's good for. And as Mary and Michael were talking about earlier, flood control. Flood control is far and away the reason why stormwater ponds are built. Originally, stormwater ponds were only built for flood control, but more recently, water quality, sorry, I thought that was going to animate in. Water quality benefits have more recently been added in and assumed, and that design strategies have been adapted to enhance water quality improvements as well. Depending on, it's unclear how effective those new ideas are, but it is a consideration now. Local residents acknowledge that flood control is a primary benefit of stormwater ponds as well. So these local resident opinions are based on focus groups that Paul Monahan and colleagues published a few years ago from Lakewood Ranch residents. From the societal, regulatory, technical perspective, water quality benefits are the second benefit that we get from stormwater ponds. That includes sediment settling. So water gets into stormwater ponds and it slows down. Any sediment that's floating through the water will eventually settle out to the bottom of the pond. There's some nutrient retention that goes on in ponds. There's retention of trash, accumulation of trash, or anthropogenic litter if you want to get fancy with the terminology, but it's just really trash. Local residents, no, water quality is not their second priority. Their second priority is increased property values. All right, yeah, I can understand that. I want my home to be worth more too. So if we can manage a stormwater pond to do that, awesome. Third priority is open water views. So aesthetic benefits of stormwater ponds. We want our stormwater ponds to look nice and look pretty. Fourth benefit is wildlife habitat. Mary said she's a birder and she likes to look at birds in her ponds. I think that's pretty common for most residents and people when they think about stormwater ponds. The fifth highest rated benefit of stormwater ponds from that Monahan study was water quality benefits. So there is an acknowledgement and an understanding that these stormwater ponds can have water quality benefits, but it's not given as much of a priority by the local residents. So this tells me that we need to come up with strategies that not only improve water quality, but also allow us to keep, maintain, or even enhance these property values, these open water views, this wildlife habitat, that sort of thing as well. There's other pond effects too that I think are less talked about. So Audrey Geckner, when she was a master's student in Mary's lab, did a study looking at carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas dynamics in stormwater ponds. She found that stormwater ponds sequester a lot of carbon. And by the time they get to be about 35 years old, they approach being a net carbon sink, so a net benefit for greenhouse gas emissions as they age. They also serve as a habitat refuge for plants and animals. So that was the conversation we were having about biodiversity. Some work by James Sinclair and colleagues has shown that There can be a lot of invasive species in stormwater ponds, a lot of invasive plant species, so that's a negative effect. But we also know that there's just a wide plant diversity overall. We also know that they can be a harbor or a habitat for a wide range of macroinvertebrates, and that stormwater pond management will really influence which macroinvertebrates are present or not. So getting back to the main topic of today's water quality. Can stormwater ponds protect water quality while remaining an amenity? First, we need to answer the question, do ponds protect downstream water quality at all? Mary touched on this a little bit, but I'll reiterate some of what she said. We know ponds are good at removing sediment. Ponds are really good at removing suspended solids from stormwater runoff and capturing it. 80 to 95% sediment removal, that's pretty standard. It's just physics. If water slows down, then anything that's suspended will slowly sink. We know that ponds are pretty good at removing phosphorus. I think Mary said about 70% of the inflowing phosphorus will be removed by stormwater ponds. I think that's about right, depending on the residence time of a pond. A big reason why ponds are so good at removing phosphorus is because phosphorus is typically bound up pretty tightly with the sediments that are already being buried. So phosphorus is a really sticky element chemically, so it binds really tightly with sediments, and so that lets that phosphorus be buried in the ponds. We also know that ponds aren't as good at removing nitrogen. So this is a figure from a classic report, the Harper and Baker report that was presented to the Florida DEP in 2007. 300 pages all about stormwater ponds, nitrogen removal, phosphorus removal, sediment removal. It's a really, really important paper and a really great reference to have. They looked at, I think, about 25 stormwater ponds throughout the state of Florida that had inflow and outflow nutrient data and looked at the removal efficiency. So how much of the inflowing nitrogen was removed relative to what exited as outflow. And they found that within the first week or two of residence time within a stormwater pond, so if water is stuck around in a stormwater pond for 2 weeks, you got to about 40% nitrogen removal. If you extended the amount of time that water was stored in those stormwater ponds to 2 years, you are still at about 40% nitrogen removal. So ponds are okay. They remove 40% of the nitrogen coming in. That's better than it just being discharged directly into our natural lakes, streams, and rivers. But 40% is not really going to cut it if we're expecting them to remove 80, 90% of the incoming nitrogen. So why aren't ponds good at removing nitrogen? Well, this is where you get into the more complicated, more in-depth biogeochemistry, ecosystem ecology, nutrient cycling processes. Mary put up a spaghetti chart diagram that showed all the different pathways that nitrogen can undergo when it enters a stormwater pond. And so some research that's starting to emerge is quantifying the rates of those nitrogen cycling pathways. And this is actually a paper from a study from North Carolina done in 2017 that looked at sediment nitrogen cycling in stormwater ponds from coastal North Carolina that ranged in age from 3-year-old to 10-year-old ponds. So what they found is if you look at this, this chart here, anything above this dashed line is a positive nitrogen flux to the atmosphere, which means nitrogen is leaving the pond because it's being denitrified. Anything below this line means that nitrogen is actually being sucked out of the atmosphere into the pond through the process of nitrogen fixation. So that means that, so the fact that all of these ponds from 0 or from 3 to 10 years, they were all net nitrogen producing systems. So actually the sediments were taking whatever was in the water and they're like, we need more nitrogen. So we're going to fix some nitrogen, making these ponds sources of nitrogen to downstream ecosystems. That was under ambient conditions. They then simulated a stormwater runoff event and added some nitrate to these systems and found that a few ponds responded by increasing nitrogen removal, but most of the ponds still remained net nitrogen sources even after you spike them with excess nitrogen availability. So this paper was the first paper that I read that got me really excited about the biogeochemistry of stormwater ponds because I wanted to know what's going on here and is this a consistent pattern that we would see in Florida as well. So a former master's student in my lab, Steve Homan, worked on a study that was funded by the Center for Landscape Conservation and Ecology. And he kind of extended that project, that 3 to 10-year-old stormwater pond gradient. Steve looked at stormwater ponds that were 10 to 35 years old and looked at ponds in Gainesville and Miami to see how similar these results would be in Florida and different parts of the state. And so he measured the same thing. Anything above the dashed line is nitrogen removal. Anything below the dashed line is nitrogen production. And under baseline conditions, when there was no excess stormwater simulation or anything like that, it hadn't rained in at least 3 days. This is kind of the baseline, what ponds are doing outside of storm events. There wasn't really much going on. Pretty low rates of nitrogen cycling, nitrogen flux. Some ponds were net nitrogen producers, most were net nitrogen removers, but it was kind of fairly balanced. When we spiked them with nitrate, we found, and so simulated a stormwater runoff event, all but one pond increased its nitrogen removal rates. So they all became net nitrogen removers. And the ability of these ponds to remove nitrogen increased fairly linearly with pond age. So older ponds are capable of removing nitrogen at higher rates than younger ponds, at least in our study. So that's really interesting. There's a couple of different reasons why that could be. Ponds accumulate carbon, pond microbial communities become more established and more diverse as they age. There could be differences in the design over that age gradient. It's unclear exactly what's driving this, but it's an interesting finding. We also found, though, that the total nitrogen cycling, not including nitrogen removal, but thinking about plant uptake and microbial uptake, the assimilation processes that Mary talked about, those also increased. And so we wanted to look at, well, how much of the nitrogen that's cycling in the system is actually being taken out of the environment versus how much is just like internally cycling and eventually will go downstream. And so we calculated the denitrification percent, which can be thought of as the efficiency of nitrogen removal. And under ambient conditions, even though there wasn't a lot of nitrogen cycling going on overall, the reason there wasn't a lot of nitrogen cycling going on is because there wasn't very much nitrogen in those ponds at the time. And so we found that about, on average, I think it was 65% of the total nitrogen taken out of the water column was being permanently removed from the ponds. When we added that stormwater runoff spike, we found that the absolute rates of nitrogen removal increased, but the efficiency actually decreased. So ponds became on average about 20% efficient at nitrogen removal. So, but this nitrogen efficiency did again increase with pond age. So they become more efficient with age, but basically if you add nitrate to a pond, every nitrogen cycling process is going to speed up. So that includes like algal growth and algal assimilation and plants and everything like that. It's not too surprising, but it was an interesting finding and an interesting result. And so we're starting to know a little bit more about what's happening in ponds under kind of just typical conditions, but it's also important to not only know what's going on, just to know what's happening in the ponds, but also how are we managing these ponds and how might that influence some of these water quality processes. And so there are three general pond management processes that we've looked at or we've considered so far. They include aeration, so stormwater pond fountains or bubblers, littoral plantings, so intentionally planting plants in the littoral shelf region, the shallow shelf or bench on the edge of ponds. And then algaecide, so chemical treatment of ponds to kill off algae and to theoretically improve water quality. And so do these management processes improve water quality? We're doing these primarily there's environmental reasons to do this, but often some of these processes are also being done for aesthetic reasons to improve the amenity these ponds are providing. So is it having a water quality benefit? Well, additional work that Steve did as a master's student found that aeration does decrease water column chlorophyll A. So there's less algae in ponds that are aerated. The aerated ponds are shown in blue here, and the non-aerated ponds in orange. And the y-axis is water column chlorophyll A, and then we're looking at three different drainage types. So ponds draining apartment complexes, ponds draining commercial areas, and ponds draining single-family home communities. So this is awesome. Pond aeration reduces algal biomass. Great, cool result. But pond aeration also increases nitrate concentrations. So again, blue is aerated, orange is non-aerated. Nitrate concentration in a log transformed state on the y-axis, you see the blue bars are higher than the orange bars. So there might be a bit of a pluses and minuses, a good and bad of aeration. And we do have a EDIS article that hopefully Emily will add to the chat here in a second that we recently published on stormwater pond aeration. It goes into some of the physical and chemical and biological processes and implications of pond aeration and pond management that you should consider if you're thinking about aerating your ponds. Littoral plantings is another pretty hot management topic. A lot of people are thinking that littoral plantings are a no-brainer benefit to water quality. And so some work that Basil Iannone led, funded by FNGLA, looked at nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations in planted and non-planted portions of the same pond. And so at the top here, you're looking at total organic nitrogen. And he found that total organic nitrogen was different between planted and non-planted parts of a pond. But that difference was different between time periods. So in October, so at the end of the wet season, planted areas had less organic nitrogen than non-planted areas. This is the end of the growing season, so ponds are probably still holding on to that nitrogen that they've sucked up from the water column. At near the end of the dry season, so kind of near the end of the non-growing season, planted areas actually had higher organic nitrogen than non-planted areas, probably because some of those plants were senescing and releasing that nitrogen back into the environment. Phosphorus was a different story. Phosphorus was typically reduced across all seasons for orthophosphorus in planted areas compared to non-planted areas. So we have some preliminary data that suggests that plantings might have an effect on water quality. A new PhD student in my lab who started last fall, Audrey Geckner, she got her master's with Mary Lusk. She's actually currently in Lakewood Ranch today doing this study, getting the study up and running. But she is looking at the effects of pond plantings on algal nutrient limitation. So she's filling all of these 1 liter plastic bottles with water from ponds, and then she's spiking the bottles with different nutrients and seeing how algae grow in the different bottles with different nutrients over time, and comparing that between planted and non-planted ponds. So more to come on this. The final management practice that's often implemented is algaecide. And so algaecide is usually done because people don't like algae. Charlie Nealis was Mark Clark's PhD student, and he his dissertation is from 2015. He did a lot of really cool work looking at the homeowner preferences and how much algal biomass they would accept, that sort of thing. So I highly suggest you take a look at his dissertation if you're interested in the public perception and need for algaecide. But one thing that we are seeing, or how I think about algae in stormwater ponds, is that algae is a bad word, but it really shouldn't be. Algae are a natural part of all of our ecosystems. There are some bad ones, like red tide, like certain cyanobacteria that are harmful, and we need to deal with those. But algae in general actually suck up a lot of nutrients from the environment. So if we look here at the relationship between nitrates, so this is inorganic nitrogen concentrations, compared to water column algal biomass, you see if there's more algae, there's less nitrogen. If there's less algae, there's more nitrogen. And so allowing some algae to stay in your pond will suck up some of those nutrients and prevent them from being pulsed downstream in a major flood event or something like that. So another thing that I want to just kind of think about and talk about, and Mario's kind of getting at this a little bit too, but really what we care about is how do these ponds affect the downstream ecosystems? Most of the research in stormwater ponds has focused on either mass balance nutrient load reductions. So we figure out how much nitrogen is coming into ponds, how much nitrogen is leaving. Cool, there's our nitrogen removal efficiency. Awesome, that tells us how good that pond is doing. Studies have focused on internal pond biogeochemistry. So the things that I talked about today, the nutrient cycling of sediments in ponds, the microbial dynamics, that sort of thing. Again, that's important work to have to get a mechanistic understanding of how these ponds are functioning. But what I think we're really missing here is that ponds aren't designed for their own benefit. We don't build a stormwater pond because we want a beautiful pond. I mean, sometimes that's an added benefit and the local homeowners want a beautiful pond, but really stormwater ponds are designed and permitted and constructed to protect the downstream ecosystems, to reduce flooding, to reduce nutrient export. And so we need more work focusing on the downstream ecological effects of stormwater ponds. So we have an upcoming project that Audrey Geckner is going to be leading, looking at the downstream consequences of stormwater ponds on riverine microbial and ecosystem function dynamics. So the Braden River, which is shown here in blue, runs through an agricultural area for most of its headwaters. And then it hits some golf course area, and then it gets into these residential communities with literally hundreds to thousands of stormwater ponds eventually feeding into the river. And so Audrey's going to be looking at changes in water quality and ecological community composition and biogeochemical dynamics at different points along this river to see if you get some shift or some change that's driven by the pond water coming into the river itself. So that'll give us an idea not only of the chemical contributions of stormwater ponds, but is the actual stream ecological community affected by these stormwater pond inflows as well. So getting back to the original question and the title of this talk, can stormwater ponds protect downstream water quality while remaining an amenity for the community? Well, residents expect flood control. They expect increased property value, open water views, and wildlife. We have various management activities that are designed to keep those expectations in mind. Aeration is one that has some major aesthetic benefits. It also does decrease chlorophyll A, but it might increase nitrate, probably because there's less algae. Littoral plantings seem like they alter nutrient availability, but it's unclear exactly what the net effect of these plants are. They do increase biodiversity and probably wildlife habitat as well. Algaecide will kill off algae, it does what it's designed to do, but if you kill off algae, you're releasing a lot of the nutrients that are bound up in those algal cells, and that could lead to an unintended consequence of an algal bloom later on in the season in that pond or in a downstream environment. So we need more research and more studies on what happens downstream. So more work looking at, do stormwater pond waters feed red tide? That's a major exciting research area that Mary's pursuing. What are the responses of rivers and streams that receive these stormwater pond runoff? And also, I think it's important to highlight and continue to keep in mind that educating homeowners that things like algae aren't necessarily a bad thing, that really the best way to keep our ponds clean is to reduce nitrogen loading coming in from the landscape, to slow the water down, to keep all of those big picture watershed scale concepts in mind is really important as well. And so if you were here last week, Paul Monahan did a lot of great work talking about some of the strategies we're implementing and some of the educational and behavior change ideas that his group is working on. So that's all I have for you all right now. I'm happy to take any questions. Here's my contact information. I'd give my phone number, but I'm not at my office enough to really be confident that you could reach me. So shoot me an email or contact me on Twitter if you have any other questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, AJ. Imagine 90 plus people applauding. Thanks very much. Let's see, questions. So I wanted to go back to one, and AJ has a hard stop at 2:30. We got about 12 minutes until then. So put your questions in the chat, and while those are coming in, Mary responded to, there was comments about the stormwater pond that she had shown where it was grass right down to the edge. Question was, can clippings get in there and contribute nitrogen? Her answer was yes, but I think it went to the panelists. Mm-hmm. So there you go for those of you out there. Let's see, questions. Is it possible for nitrogen/nitrate concentrations to infiltrate into our fresh water sources?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so there are a variety of different ways stormwater ponds can be designed. Sometimes they're designed to have the water actually infiltrate into the ground. Sometimes they're designed to discharge to downstream environments. So depending on what design that pond has, and that's largely driven by the water table and the hydrology of the region. But just because nitrogen goes into a stormwater pond, it's eventually going to make its way to some source of water, either groundwater or surface waters or coastal waters that we care about.
They're connected.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot of connections with water in Florida. Hence, that results in a lot of our challenges. I had a question. Thank you, River Gypsy from Dragonfly. You know, as you're talking about this, as Mary was talking, I was thinking in another life, I had a bunch of colleagues that they designed treatment wetlands. So this is a way to, usually it's employed in lower cost agricultural operations, waste operations. But you see that in City of Gainesville has essentially a treatment wetland, Sweetwater Park. So could stormwater ponds be designed in a way that it was not just hydraulic, more or less, but also addressed other contaminants? And if so, what would that, I'm asking you to speculate a little bit here.
Yeah.
What would that lead to in terms of cost and complexity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So treatment wetlands, I think they can be scaled, like there can be very different scales. The Sweetwater wetlands at Gainesville is huge. The city of Ocala, I believe, just recently opened a huge treatment wetland as well. Yep. Stormwater ponds are usually not at that same scale, so it's hard to get some of those big regional benefits that you probably won't get the same level of burden coming into a small stormwater treatment wetland compared to a huge constructed wetland like that. But that being said, we're actually working with a few different groups. We're particularly working with a landscape architecture firm that was hired by a conservation group to brainstorm new ways to design a stormwater pond that they manage. Right now, the stormwater pond is a trapezoidal hole in the ground, square on all four sides, you know what you expect to see. And so we came up with a few different ideas, working with Basil and Eben as well, and Jennison. We went out there and just brainstormed like, okay, let's put some berms in here so that the water flows around a little bit. And so make it almost like a flowing pond or wetland that like there's some hydrologic variability, some different habitats in there, that sort of thing. I think that there's interest and a lot of good cutting edge design for those more enhanced stormwater systems. It's a little tricky, and I think it's an easier sell in new construction. It's a little trickier in retrofits because you can't remove the flood control aspects. You can't remove the storage volume that those ponds have. There are also ways to maximize storage using things like smart sensors that, like similar to irrigation, you can get smart stormwater sensors that tap into the weather report and say, oh, there's a storm coming. I need to drop my water levels so I have more storage for that next storm event to come in. Or, oh, there's no storm coming. I can fill up a little bit more and keep this water in and allow for more processing. So there's a few different ways that this can be done, and there's some really interesting and innovative approaches, but it's going to be more expensive than a four-corner hole in the ground. Yeah. So I don't think it's going to be something that many are going to voluntarily take on, I would imagine.
Unless Dr. Reisinger's lab discovers through their intense study of stormwater ponds, they understand the dynamics to the point that they invent some process or bug that mitigates this nitrogen issue in stormwater ponds.
I think some other doctor is going to be the one that comes up with those inventions, probably.
Anyway, kind of a cool alternate scenario. Someone did ask a question. They asked if the stormwater ponds were natural water features or if they were all man-made.
Yeah, I think, so when I say stormwater ponds, I'm specifically talking about man-made systems that are designed and constructed and managed by humans. There are some natural water bodies are sometimes serve double duty as stormwater storage, but any new construction has to deal with stormwater runoff without impacting natural water bodies, I believe. Not an expert on permitting, so don't quote me on that. But yeah, stormwater ponds are intentionally built and designed because of the urban development.
Yeah. Okay, some questions coming in here. Are bubblers and fountains equally effective at removing chlorophyll A? And do fountains contribute to bank erosion?
Yeah, those are good questions. So we haven't done a direct like scientific database investigation comparing bubblers to fountains, so I can't say for certain. I can say that bubblers and fountains are, the difference between the two is really which type of a system you would want to use them in. Bubblers usually, so anyone that doesn't know, a bubbler is something that is usually installed at the bottom of your pond, and air is pumped to the bottom of the pond, and then bubbles float up through the entire water column. Whereas a fountain sits on the surface, sucks air in, and then pushes that through the water and blows water up into the air, and so you get some aeration that way. Bubblers are usually more effective, and they're both the main intention for those is to increase oxygen in the water, so you don't have a fish kill or something like that. Fountains are better at local oxygenation and for shallower ponds. Bubblers are much better if you have a deeper pond, and because a fountain is only going to affect the water that it comes into contact with and the water that it sucks up. And so yes, but at the same time, one of the benefits that we see with fountains, one of the mechanisms we think is that when the water splashes down on the surface, that kind of increases it makes the water less stagnant, and so that might disrupt some of the algal formation processes, but I'm not a phycologist. You'd have to talk to Dale Laughinghouse, and he'll probably tell me otherwise on that. So I think the fountain versus bubbler decision is really based on what type of a pond you're working in.
All right. Could your data regarding nitrogen keep HOAs from pond, prevent them from pond perimeter planting? The planting has other benefits, right?
Yeah, so I think I just today I was focused primarily on nutrients, but littoral planting and littoral plantings, I don't think anything that I showed, and that is very preliminary. I think Basil, who was the lead on that, he himself would say, like, let's look at that with a squint at best. But it's more showing that I think when I talk to a lot of people that are thinking about stormwater pond management from the professional development side or from like watershed management perspective, I think people think that pond plantings and their effects on water quality are a done deal, and we know everything that we know. And we really don't. We know a little bit about what they should do, and we know a little bit about from like lab-based studies and things, but we don't know much at the larger scale. That's not to say that I'm not going to sit here and tell you that ponds are 100% going to improve water quality of the pond, but I'm also not going to sit here and tell you that that's the only thing we should care about. There's aesthetic benefits, there's diversity benefits, there's erosion control. I didn't touch on erosion from the aeration question either. Aeration can be a concern if you have too big of a fountain or too big of a bubbler for your pond and you're having wave action. That can be a major issue, but littoral plantings can actually reduce that erosion because they hold on to those sediments.
Well, on the theme of plantings, we got just 3 more minutes. Any idea on how well floating plant islands, where plant roots and tops are removed annually, work to remove nutrients? And we've seen this locally in Lake Alice. When it gets really bad out there, they bring a machine out there and
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm talking with some folks in Pinellas County, I think, that are thinking about some floating islands as well. And I think the comment of when the plants are removed annually, that's really a crucial one, because that's, I think, the main way that floating islands will remove nutrients is by plants taking them up. But if you don't get those plants out of the pond, then those nutrients just go back in. I also have seen some folks study floating islands and have found that they're actually attractors for birds, which is really great from a wildlife perspective. But then when birds come and roost on a floating island, they've got to pee and poop somewhere. And so they actually bring more nutrients in through that process. So their ecology is complicated. That's,
and that other life I mentioned where colleagues of mine were designing treatment wetlands, ducks and geese would move in and fecal coliform would go through the roof.
Yep.
None coming in, but it's all going out. So every action has a reaction, right? Okay, so Mary actually asks, great job, AJ. What about aeration made for a reduction in chlorophyll A?
So we don't know. We don't have the exact mechanism nailed down. It was kind of a surprise, but I think it's I think some of it is the turbulence being induced at the surface of the water. Or it could be indicative of, like, there could be some other driver that's happening there, but we saw it across 50 ponds. So I think it's a pretty robust response. I really don't know. It could be a redistribution of nutrients throughout the water column. Sorry, I don't have a better answer than that.
Last question. Have any comparisons been studied between stormwater ponds with cypress trees as a component of the pond's flora versus those without, in respect to N management?
Not that I'm aware of. I saw that question as well. So not that I'm aware of. I think that there are cypress trees at some of the ponds, on some of the ponds in Lakewood Ranch that we've worked in and in other locations. But that's not to say that nobody's done it, but I'm not aware of any that have explicitly looked at cypress versus other plants. I noticed in the chat that there were some comments and questions about stormwater ponds in South Florida don't drain to streams because there aren't streams in South Florida and there's canals. And I just wanted to say that, yeah, the same processes that I think of when I think of downstream streams, canals are equally important for moving nutrients and water to Biscayne Bay or to wherever else you're interested in. And understanding how pond runoff influences canal dynamics is another thing that we're thinking a lot about. We don't have any ongoing research, but it's something that I've been talking a lot about with folks down in Homestead.
Very good. Well, it's just over 2:30 and I know you got to run. So I want to thank you, AJ, and Mary, thank you very much. Everyone is being very complimentary in the comments. So thanks again. Thank you all for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next week, Wednesday at 1 p.m. We'll have more talk on water quality and amendments, and we'll have a DEP representative here. So thank you. You all have a good day. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Thanks, Michael.